Thank you very much, Alison, and good evening to everybody. It's a hot, sultry evening here in my office, so you'll excuse me if now and again I take a little drop of water, okay? So this project or this paper is based on some ongoing work that I've been undertaking in connection with UEFA, and it's an apposite time, I think, to have a look at these issues, particularly given that the Women's Euros are taking place at the moment, and obviously a marvelous and growing event. And anybody who watched the game last night will see what tremendous entertainment and progression women's football has experienced over the last 20 years or so. I was very lucky to be live at the Netherlands versus Sweden game on Saturday, and that was the biggest attendance for a non-host team in women's international competition. So that was a really vibrant and fantastic experience. I'm not going to be talking about elite football in this particular context. We're going to be looking at mass participation, and particularly going to compare effectively some values connected with participation in football. And I've noted there three sort of outcomes that are seen as important for policy. And so we're going to focus on those. But before I start, I just want to make some acknowledgements in connection with this project. So this is a joint project that I'm undertaking with Professor Pam Wicker. And Pam and I have worked together for a long time. She's a professor of sports economics and sociology at Bielefeld University in Germany, and formerly at the German Sports University. The project was supported by Liam McGraw, who's the Strategic Development Manager at UEFA. And we're working in consultation with Substance Consulting, and Tim Crabb, who's the Chief Executive, effectively commissioned this work on behalf of UEFA. So just to give you a bit of an overview of where the presentation's going to go. I'll talk a little bit about the context of the research and some of the research questions that we looked at. I will quickly take you through some of the main literature and some of the main findings, but also indicate why we undertook this specific study. And we've adopted what might be called a theory-led valuation. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback. A theory-led valuation approach. I'll take you through the data and particularly the survey we undertook, the measures that we adopted, and the analysis and results, and draw some conclusions. But perhaps before we start, it's probably worth having a look at the picture over here, which is interesting because this is showing you that although we've been talking about women's football as a kind of recent phenomenon, it's not actually that new. And from the inception of the game, women always played football. And in fact, they had large-scale attendances in the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. And it was only in the 1920s that the FA banned women from playing. And I think there's probably two reasons for that. One, the argument was a kind of Victorian propriety. It's not the sort of things that ladies should be doing. But I think it was part of a broader agenda about getting women back into the home in the post-World War I era, when men were coming back from the war front and so on. So it was part of that kind of stranglehold, if you like, of Victorian values that put barriers in place from women taking part in many, many sports. So certainly when I was at school, girls tended to play netball only and did a bit of athletics, where guys had access to all the other team sports as well. Thankfully, that's now changed. So basically, women's football re-emerged in the 1960s with the development of the Women's Football Association, and then effectively became absorbed into the wider FA subsequently, and the rest is history, so to say. So thankfully, we now have widespread female football. So let's get on then with having a look at the context of the research. And the sort of background to this really, and the project we're doing, is part of a wider policy agenda really, which is to focus on, and you'll see the connection with this specifically with football later, but clearly physical activity is perceived to be of extreme importance in the sort of, let's call it, Western world. because of the obesity crisis and the development of non-communicable diseases. So, for example, heart, strokes, cancers, and so on and so on that I note there. And this is quite pertinent for me because I was a rugby player all my life. I didn't drink and I don't smoke. And I've had a heart attack and I've since developed diabetes and I've lived a really good life. So I've now started drinking again. And I don't know whether I'll carry on playing any sport or what have you, but at least in theory, I might be the exception. Physical activity is important for the development of or the prevention of the incidence of these kind of diseases and so on. So it matters not only for football associations, but for all sports organizations to be able to speak to this kind of agenda. The interesting thing too is that as well as sort of those kind of medical outcomes, policy now is interested in much broader things too. For example, Sporting Future, which was a strategy developed by the Cameron Clegg coalition government and published in 2015. And although we've had a select committee, House of Lords select committee report on sport since then, it still kind of forms the backdrop of current thinking. And Sporting Future as a strategy was basically saying that for sport to receive funding, to continue to receive funding, it's got to really deliver some outcomes. So public funding is linked to public outcomes. And the kind of 5 main outcomes that are identified in terms of sport are obviously mental well-being, individual development, which is what we might call as economists, human capital, that is education and employability, social and community development, and of course, economic development. And since the pandemic, community development and so on have become very important. If you look at the Uniting the Movement, Sport England recent strategy, it's about reconnecting communities and so on and addressing the same kind of outcomes. So what's interesting about this policy agenda is that it's a shift away from how sport used to be. So I'm old enough to remember the 1970s and sport for all. And that was really about sport for sport's sake, doing sport because it was just good. Okay, it's intrinsically good. With the Blair government and subsequently, you probably know some of the background to that, the development of UK sport, the breakaway of the Great Britain Sport Council into UK sport and the sports councils became that kind of change in sports policy was about delivering more focused outcomes for society. If you're getting public money, you've got to deliver something for us, whether it's elite success or wider health and what have you outcomes. And so this is part of that agenda. And what that strategy Sporting Future did really compared to the trajectory of the past was simply say, we'd be quite happy to fund any organization providing it delivers these outcomes for us. So I know that a lot of traditional sports were essentially quite concerned about this because what you have here is the potential that somebody else could come along and deliver these things for you. So if you look in this strategy, for example, parkrun is held up as a case study of best practice. You know, it's got people active and it's not connected to traditional sport. And it's something that traditional running hasn't been able to deliver and so on. So this kind of matters. And it matters because, for example, you get these kind of figures thrown around in the policy debates whereby, you know, if you spend £1 on sport, you'll get £4 in return in terms of these kind of outcomes. So this is the thing that government's interested in and sports organizations are interested in, because if you can show that there's a good outcome against these things, then you can justify public sector support. Okay, so this is connected to the idea of what's called a social return on investment analysis, which is basically saying that if we invest in something, society benefits. And it's not in the sort of simple profit and loss sense. It's in terms of some of these other factors that we recognize to be important. And they're often intangible. Mental well-being, for example, individual development. So the interesting question is how do you monetize those? How do you put a scale on those in order to understand what the return is? It's fairly easy to do it from a sort of an event in profit and loss terms. You know, you have X customers and they paid X and you get an amount and you can set that off against the costs and so on. So traditional kind of just purely economic impact of sport, is one thing, but this is about trying to monetize and look at the return on things that are effectively intangible. And so the exercise I'll go through later is to indicate what it is that we try to do to speak to this agenda. So to reiterate then, there's this agenda at the moment about developing social returns on investment. And this is all about justifying and evaluating investment in sporting activity. And of course, governments want to hear that if they're going to provide sport. And sporting organizations might want to demonstrate that because then they can get access to those funds. And UEFA, of course, are very interested in this from a pan-European context. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is the existing evidence base tends to be based on a literature synthesis. So I'll talk a little bit later about some of the specific literature that's involved, but just at the moment, the kind of studies that have fed into those numbers that I talked about earlier, that £1 of investment leads to £4 of return, is based on really an aggregate form of engagement. So it's studies that have looked at sport in general, and it may be in sports that are not connected to the one that you're involved in. It's just a general measure of sport in society. Because the issue here is about the quality of data that we have in order to do the calculations and so on. So that previous study that I mentioned to you is based on this kind of literature synthesis. So in order to try to be a little bit more forensic, we focused for UEFA on grassroots football in Europe. And rather than looking at sport in general, we looked at the various types of engagement in sport, particularly football, obviously. So whether that be organized 11-a-side competition or more informal, short-sided competition, or maybe it's just purely recreational, and that matters. And also we drew a distinction between males and females. So the idea was to offer a much more bespoke kind of analysis that exists in the existing literature. So our key research questions then are, first of all, how is participation in these different types of football associated with these outcomes of health, social, and well-being for both males and females? And I guess also what monetary values can be assigned to these associations. So that was the sort of research task that we had. Now, leaving aside UEFA's obvious interest in football, the importance of football also matters, I think, for the wider literature. Because on the one hand, football is the largest participation team sport, certainly in the UK and certainly across Europe. And if we were in an interactive room now, I'd ask you, have you any idea what the participation rates are for football? But I'll ask the question and then answer it myself. And the answer is probably less than you think. So if we look at participation in any form of football, for example, in looking at the active lives data in 2015 and 16, it was about 9% of males, 9.6 or something like that percent of males, and just under 1% for females. And that hasn't really changed a lot over almost the last decade. Obviously, there was a dip because of COVID, of course. So if you look in the early 2021 period, down to about 4% of participation for males and about 0.7% for females. And it's picking up a little bit. But I think the interesting thing there is it's a relatively small scale participation rate. And this is the largest sport. If you look at other team sports, then participation rates get much closer to 2s and 1%. So it's kind of important to look at football because it's the biggest team sport and it offers some insight into the potential contribution. I should add that of those that participate, it's about 50% that participate in a formal club-based approach. So a lot of football takes place outside of organized domains. Now, it could also be that people who are in teams play in the informal sense as well. But effectively, if you look at the isolated types of football, then the kind of more organized game is about a half of that. Okay. So that's one of the other reasons why it's important to look at football. The second thing, of course, is it allows us to look at these formal and informal contexts, and that will help us to be able to say something about where the relative priority for investment might be. Not to put too fine a point on, as an economist, you would often say that participation rates vary inversely with the resource costs involved. So I'll leave it for you, and you don't need to be an economist to work this out, that if you compare the participation rates of leisure walking with, say, yachting, it's a no-brainer to wonder which will be the most highly participated. Because not only is there less time involved, but there's also considerably less money. And so team sports are timely and time-intensive activities, and they're often equipment-intensive activities too. So they're relatively small scale, but they take place in a variety of different formats. And of course, informal football doesn't require the same resources as the formal one. Okay. The other thing, of course, which we can't underestimate, is that football is the most rapidly developing sport for females, and it's certainly challenging traditional patterns of sports participation. And for those old enough to remember, there's a well-worn quote there from Bill Shankly that's that sort of captures also one of the reasons why football fans might think that it's important to look at this. Okay, so those are the reasons why we want to look at football. Now, just starting to move into the background for the evaluation, I just want to flag up now some of the thinking that led to the study. I want to start off by just drawing your attention to this report. So this is a report that was undertaken by basically two Nobel Prize winners, Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz, who are economists working with a member of the European Union, and ironically on behalf of the Sarkozy government. And this report wanted to look at the measurement of economic performance and social progress. And so quite, I suppose, oddly, two economists were challenging the traditional measure of what's called gross domestic product, or GDP. You'll often hear about that, talked about on the news. It's kind of like an aggregate of the incomes earned in the economy as a measure of quality of life. So basically, GDP measures expenditures, which are conversely people's incomes. They're two sides of the same coin. Okay. And quite ironically, with GDP, if you're sitting in a traffic jam burning fuel, you're actually adding to GDP because you're consuming basically resources, and you're buying those things. You're also contributing to sustainability problems, but none of that gets picked up in GDP. So the whole point of this report was to challenge those measures and to say, hey, we also need to look at some other things as well, not just look at incomes and expenditures, but to look at the quality of life. So what are some of the factors then that can contribute to quality of life? And you can start to see the antecedents to the Sporting Future strategy, because clearly one of them that's measured explicitly is health. And we know this from sort of health valuations. So if anybody's familiar with the health field will know that there's lots of studies in health about measuring the efficacy of treatments and what brings about the greatest quality of life improvements. So you could have 10 years in pain, perhaps, or 1 year pain-free. Which one is the most, if you like, greater quality? It's not just about adding up the number of years that you're alive. That's why I've started drinking again. I probably will shorten my life, but at least I've started to have a bit of fun. Okay. So health clearly is one. The other one, of course, is the things that we've already mentioned, which is well-being and the social connections we've got and the trust we have in others. So that's pretty topical at the moment politically. And I know we're not meant to get over political with this, but clearly there have been major breaches of trust in public authorities recently. And this matters because it attacks societies. You can see both with Trump and with the current government here that once you challenge trust in society, you get fragmentation and people are not happy. And you can get all sorts of nefarious things happening as a result of that. So social connectivity and trust are important. And what we're talking about here is social capital, is effectively the collective resource that we have to draw on that improves our lives. So these things matter. And it was this kind of commission that generated the importance of looking at these things. And so much so, and you'll see later when we look at the measures that we've adopted, that the OECD has given guidelines on how these things should be measured, and that developed from this report. And the Office for National Statistics now has standardized measures for capturing these things within national statistics within the UK. Okay. So if we move now into the wider literature, and what we're talking about here is some of the things that would have underpinned the study I mentioned earlier, the social return on investment, the more aggregate study for the UK, but also covers other literature from around the world. And what do we know about sport and these outcomes? Well, what we do know is that sport is very strongly linked to health improvements and feelings of health. I've just put a few references there, but this is a pretty much dominant finding in the literature. The interesting thing about these studies is that the measures of sport that often exist in official data are often very generalized. So they'll just simply be, have you undertaken sport or physical activity or not? And there'll be a definition of that, but there won't be specific kinds and so on. Okay. When we look at well-being, then we get similar results, and possibly not surprising because health and well-being are very closely related, of course. I mean, in fact, some people tend to think about well-being as being psychological health and health being physical health. Okay. A couple of interesting points to note from this is in some of this earlier work that I did, and my goodness, it's over a decade ago. Time flies. Well, we found, for example, that when we looked at sports, individual sports did contribute to people's well-being, but not as much as sports undertaken with groups, and certainly not as much as undertaken with teams when there were more in the group. So something like tennis had a higher return than, say, something like running on your own, effectively, leisure running. Okay, and then if you're in a team sport, it was higher still. So there's something about this collectivity that sort of matters. Okay, so there is some incidence, and this is, of course, what's prompted the desire to look at different types of football, because there are different potential impacts depending on the way in which it's socially organized. I also want to caution against the use of health and well-being at the same time. A study that I did with my colleague from the University of East Anglia even that's a long time ago now, it's sort of 7, 8 years ago, is that health and well-being aren't the same. We did a study where we looked at kind of the health thresholds that people have, so if you're aware of health enhancing physical activity, there's so many minutes of moderate or vigorous or equivalent to tense minutes that you need to do. So in moderate equivalent terms, if you can do 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity, that's going to generate health benefits. And what we found, strangely enough, was that of those people who did the more health enhancing levels of sport, they didn't have the same well-being as those that did sport in a much more casual way. And if you reflect on that, there may be something fairly obvious about that. When we think about sport and its origins, it was about collective engagement and stuff for fun. In a sense, health is a side part plan. If you play at an intense level, then maybe the fun starts to drop away. To put it crudely, have you ever seen a happy triathlete who plays, and trains really hard and is on that envelope all the time? And yet, to use the vernacular, the common if you look at a bunch of slightly overweight guys on a Friday, kicking a football around on a small 3G pitch, and then they disappearing off to the pub after, they're probably pretty happy. Okay, so you can't just assume these things are the same. There's overlap, but they're not the same. Okay. Now, what about social capital? Well, it turns out the results here are a bit more nuanced. They're not so robust, let's say. And so if we look at sport and social capital, we can think about the social capital being connected to, for example, belonging to a club. This is basically belonging to an association, or maybe volunteering within the club, or more generally. Okay. And this could be linked to also trust. And trust is effectively how we feel about our neighbors. Okay. Now, what you tend to find is that measures of club membership and volunteering are not necessarily connected with an increase in trust. So in a study that I was involved in, we found that being connected to, say, a sports association, as with a religious association, actually reduced trust compared to belonging to, say, a political association or another civic society organization. And that seems like prima facie a slightly puzzling result. But then actually, when you look at the social capital literature, it draws a distinction between what we might call bonding and bridging social capital, or sometimes referred to as horizontal and vertical social capital. And horizontal social capital is when you're bringing together people of the same sort. So it's bonding similar people together. And actually, when you think about sports clubs, that's what they're like. They have a culture that's, of similarity, essentially. Whereas bridging social capital is about uniting more diverse groups. Now, if you're asking about trust in others and you're only trusting people who are similar to yourself, then clearly that could explain why we get a negative result. And it's rather like religion too. You belong to this group or that group, as opposed to thinking across groups. Okay. I don't shout at me if you belong to a particular church or something like that. And we know that, the rhetoric is that we're inclusive and blah, blah, blah. The same with sports clubs. But the reality is when you look at them, congregations tend to be relatively homogenous. Okay. Now, interestingly, some recent work that's been done has identified that trust is higher if your membership is more diverse. So I think it speaks to that a little bit. So that's about belonging to a club as a volunteer or a member. If you actually look at participation, and then what you find is that you can raise volunteering, which is, again, maybe another form of social capital. So people who participate in sport are likely also to volunteer and get connected to wider society. But it's not the case with trust again. Okay. And these were studies of young people's participation. And in some further work that I did, we didn't find a direct association between, for example, participation and trust. So I think the point is here, and you can debate the nuances of this, but there are differences compared to, say, health and well-being, where there's unilaterally a positive effect wherever you kind of look and whatever measures you take. It's much more tricky with the social stuff. So this now leads me then into how we actually started to evaluate these outcomes. And we take our lead from economic theory. Well, that's probably pretty obvious because I'm professor of economics, so it would be a bit odd if I didn't use that. But this theory-led evaluation is actually drawing on that earlier work from those economists I mentioned in the report on social progress. And effectively what they try to argue theoretically is that you can effectively think about the quality of life as being what economists call the indirect utility of individuals. And all this indirect utility is an expression of people's well-being in monetary terms or in kind of tangible terms. So it's turning things that are intangible into tangible terms. So you can see that that's the problematic that faces social return on investment. So there's a bit of background theory to that. And this theory has also found its way into government advice on investment appraisal. So there's a sort of HM Treasury and DWP red paper book here that looks about valuation techniques for social cost benefit analytics. Okay, so I'm drawing effectively on that framework. And as I say, what we're effectively trying to do is to basically observe behavior, identify that with improvements in well-being or its constituent parts, and then try to monetize that. Okay, and we monetize it by using something that's known as equivalent or compensating variation. And I'll say something more about that later. But before we get on to that, I will tell you a little bit about the data that we used. So because of the problems of traditional official data sets, maybe measuring the outcomes we're interested in, but measuring sport in a very crude way, we actually did a survey. And so we sent an online survey out to adults who were members of the consumer panels of a market research company called Toluna. okay, based in Germany. And the survey went out between February the 22nd and March the 8th in 2021. Okay. Now, because we wanted a European dimension of things, we surveyed a number of countries. So the UK, Germany, Italy, Poland, Romania, Russia, Sweden, and Bosnia. And the idea here, because it was clearly too expensive to survey all 20, well, it was 27 countries of the EU, too expensive. We took snapshots of countries that captured, for example, Scandinavia, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and of course, what you might call the northwestern part of Europe and so on. Okay. We surveyed 1,000 people in each country except Bosnia, which was smaller in population size, where we surveyed 500. So we ended up with a sample size of 7,500 people. And the sample was constructed to be representative in terms of key demographics, so age, gender, and income. And income was quite important because that's what we're using to monetize the value of the participation. However, we oversampled footballers because if you remember earlier, I was saying that at most, just under 10% of the population participates or not. We wanted to get a fairly robust measure of participation. So we effectively tried to identify at least 400 people within each sample that participated in football. Because you want a clear signal from the football participation versus not participating. You don't want that to be driven by small sample peculiarities, let's say. So I just indicated there some of the statistics. So there's an overrepresentation of footballers by design. Now, in terms of our measures, and you probably could have gathered that from looking at the survey period, we're actually asking or sending out the survey during the COVID era. So not that we're out of it, but when it was at its height. So we were asking people about before the COVID-19 pandemic. And we checked our measures by asking them about their current feelings and also their period before COVID-19 as a kind of sensitivity check on whether our numbers were making sense. But before I get on to illustrating that, our questions looking at health were taken from previous studies that have been used to look at the impacts of health from football. So studied by the FA, some of Pam's previous work, some of my work. And in fact, this 5-point scale from very good to very poor is also captured in a lot of national statistics. So it's basically a 5-point Likert scale. We measured well-being based on the question that's in the DCMS's Taking Part survey. That's been replaced now by the participation survey, but the Taking Part survey commissioned by the DCMS from 2005 up to 15-16. And it measured cultural arts, entertainment, and sport engagement. So it's a national survey. So we used that question, and this was on a effectively 11-point scale. So people are asked about whether they're extremely unhappy to rank themselves to be extremely happy. And again, that's a measure of well-being that's used nationally and internationally. And last, our question about trust was asked. Again, this is based on the OECD evaluation of metrics of trust. And it asks people in general, how much do you think that people could be trusted? And again, the response ranged from 0 to 10. Okay, so these are our key outcome measures that we're using to measure these policy targets. And we're using effectively official measures to try and inform the impacts, because we effectively want to speak to governments, of course. Now, just through a little table in here that I constructed the other day, this just illustrates the before COVID and the last 4 weeks we asked, which is typically the period that's asked about in terms of the sports participation questions in, say, taking part. So effectively how they felt before COVID and during COVID effectively. If you have a look at our measures, so for example, this is our happiness measure. You'll see that before COVID, the typical scores are up in this range. You'll see later that the average comes out at just around about 7. Okay. And then you see when you look at the last 4 weeks during COVID, that happiness is shifted to the left. So this distribution shifted across to the left. And it's the same with trust. Okay. And it's the same with health. So I think we can argue from that we weren't confounding our measures of before COVID with how people were currently feeling. And if you track the national statistics, you can see that those metrics also drop and then pick up again. So I think that that was a good check on whether asking before COVID was potentially problematic or not. Now, in terms of focusing on football, we asked about 11-a-side competitive football in a club. We asked about small-sided football at a sports facility, and we asked about informal football in a public space. So if you like, there's a degree of kind of organizational to entirely informal in these measures. Okay. So those are our measures of sports participation. And we asked them, following the taking part survey, in a typical 4-week period, did you participate in these activities or not? Now, we also had to ask about our income, because income is the variable that we're going to use to measure the monetary value of these activities. So we took a measure of people's personal net monthly income or equivalent access to financial resources. And we set up a set of questions where people could tick a box based on country level distributions of those income profiles. So we picked up a good representative sample of the range of incomes that can be identified. And last but not least, we identified some important confounding variables, because clearly what we're interested in here is the impact of sport, football in this case, on the dependent variable, which in our case is your health, your well-being, and your social capital. And we recognize that certain things could affect both of those, and we need to control for those. So we included, for example, people's age. We included their educational level, if people had a respondent, had a partner or not, the number of dependent children, if the respondent watched sport and participated in other sports, and so on. So all of these are factors that we know from the literature could affect those outcomes. Now, excuse for the small size of the font here, but you can see this is the mean value of the happiness and trust variables. You can see they're around about 7 and 6, and there's fairly tight standard deviation. So these things tend to be skewed up to the right, which is a common finding in the literature. Whether you're comparing, say, the happiness in Sri Lanka with that in USA, you'll find the average comes out at around about 7. So we're fairly confident that these results capture what is normal. You can see here the proportions of people playing football. Now, again, these are not population-based measures. They're not like inferences about the population, because we asked specifically to oversample number of footballers. But you can sort of see there that in terms an average, to think about these as sample proportions, effectively informal football is slightly more common than the formal side of the game. And then you've got these other variables in here that were part of the analysis. Okay. Now, in terms of the analysis, I don't want to bore you down with the statistics here, but effectively what we have to do is to build a statistical model where we have the measurement of our outcome, and then we identify the contribution of playing football, income, and all these other factors on that outcome. And we try to estimate these things here, which are called coefficients. And these tell us, for example, in this case, if you play football or not, what is the impact of that on the outcome? And this what's called coefficient measures that. Equally, this coefficient here, B3, measures the impact of a change in your income on that outcome. And so we exploit the information that we have on this to effectively evaluate the contribution of football to your outcome in money terms. And we're able to do that based on that theory that I mentioned earlier by simply dividing these two coefficients by one another. Okay. And these effectively give us the change in income value required, let's say it increases, to compensate for a reduction in football, leaving the outcome unchanged. So there's a bit of kind of theoretical reflection behind that, which I don't want to go into, but that's why it's called an equivalent or compensating variation measure. You basically look at the contribution of one that would be required to compensate for not doing the other. So how much of an increase in income is needed to compensate for not playing football? Or equally, if you play football, what reduction in income would you be prepared to pay in order to leave your overall outcome unchanged? So you're exploiting the idea that income and football affect those outcomes, and you're saying, leaving the outcome unchanged, what is the adjustment between those two activities or those two resources is required to leave your overall state unchanged. And we exploit that to get the monetary values. One thing I just want to sort of highlight here is these are these estimated coefficients. This is our B2s here, and we've distinguished between male and female. So this is our 11 aside, and here are income measures. And the important thing for us is they're statistically significant, because if they're not, we can't engage in our exercise. And what you'll note there is that these numbers tend to go up as you move towards the informal level. And what that's suggesting is that qualitatively here at least, that if you participate in these informal sports, they're having a bigger effect on the outcomes than, say, in the more formal. They're all having a positive effect, but the relative size is bigger for the informal activity. Okay. And we've got our significant incomes, which we need. So we do a similar exercise again, for example, for trust. Okay. And I won't bother you too much with the details. What I'll do is I'll come up and identify the main factors. What the results showed to us is that we get larger coefficients for females compared to males. So what that's basically saying, for each of those outcomes, participating in football has a bigger effect on them for females compared to males. And in terms of the outcomes, it's the impact on trust that's the relatively largest. Okay. In terms of the confounders, sorry, that's flashing around. I have to try and free my mouse to go onto the slide mover. We found some commonality with the literature, which again, I'm not going to over concentrate on at the moment. I will just push through to the final results. We found some differences and similarities, but this is the bit that really matters, because these are our monetized values. Okay, so this is where we put the money values on those coefficients. And what we can see here is that for all the different types of football and for the different outcomes, the female valuations are higher. Okay. And of the overall valuations, it's the trust measure that is higher than the other measures. Okay. And if you look at them collectively, compared to, say, the formal 11-a-sided game, it's the less formal value that has the highest value. And this could speak, of course, to that idea I mentioned to you before about the social connectivity involved with sport that may be not necessarily connected to health. And this is certainly the case when we look at males, because the impact of sport on their self-stated health was actually not significant for males. Okay, but it was for the very informal game. Okay, and that speaks to this idea that maybe sport and the concept of health don't gel in the minds of many male players. Okay. Now, there are some limitations to this work, and one of them is that these are associational measures. They're not causal studies. We did do some causal work, and so we're confident that we do have causal effects, but the valuations were a bit skewed and suggest there were some problems with the statistical controls we tried to do for that, but won't get too bogged down in that. Another interesting question that might be floating around in your head, but I think it's an important one, is that these monetary values that we've identified are effectively an attempt to put an absolute value on something that is actually a relative scale. And there's a bit of a conundrum here. And I think that conundrum is not resolved by what we've done. Clearly, the values you get will be scale contingent. So if you use a different set of metrics for your outcomes, you will get different numbers. Okay. What we found in our work is they will preserve the order of the rankings. So essentially what you have with these studies is some sense of the absolute value of these things, the return that comes to people for playing these sports. But probably what's more important is the relative scale, where priorities might need to go. So in terms of some of the implications then, clearly the main message that came from our study was that you'll have greater returns relatively from investing in female football. You'll have greater returns for investing in formal forms of football. And clearly, this raises challenges to traditional sports organizations that historically, at least, have focused on the male game, and they have a natural focus on the organized 11-a-side competition. Okay, so there's a bit of a tension there between kind of what traditional sports do and where the biggest impact of football is. And so it speaks to a need to have, perhaps to rethink about where the priorities are and so on. So I think I was given 45 minutes to speak or something like that. So I've kind of finished there. So thank you very much for your attention on this hot, sultry night. And I hope, leaving aside the slightly pointy-heady bits of analysis, the message, at least from the research, was relatively clear and informative and useful to you. So I'm very happy to take questions or whatever. I'm not quite sure how this will work. Maybe people in the chat or, yeah.
I can step in and help you out there, Paul. Thank you very much for that. That was really, really interesting. Good evening, everybody. My name's Esther, so I'm just going to help facilitate Q&A if anybody has any questions. If you'd like to speak to Paul directly, then you can raise your hand, which you should be able to find under the reactions tab at the bottom, or you can put a question into the chat if you'd rather do that, and we will get to as many of them as we can. Just a first one that's come through to me, Paul, just to kind of kick us off. Based on what you said, should we be focusing on investing in female football over and above the male game?
The answer is yes.
How popular do you think that will be?
Well, this is the really interesting thing, isn't it? And I think clearly, because what's probably lurking behind these results, and again, as an economist, it's one of those, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail kind of scenarios. As an economist, one of the things that we know that drives value is relative scarcity in society. So this is why Van Gogh painting is extremely valuable compared to, say, some daubing that an ordinary human being would sort of produce. And it's actually manifest in economics in something known as the diamond water paradox. So speaking of water, I will just lubricate my throat. Essential to life, but it comes out of the tap free. You know, whereas if you look at something like a diamond, leaving aside the problems of artificial monopolies, you've effectively got something that's may have some industrial uses, but it's just an ornament, and it's at the margin, it's very expensive, and that's because of scarcity. So for economists, scarcity and value are bedfellows. So it strikes me that as the game's emerging, the marginal return, that is the marginal value, is always going to be higher for females. So this is exactly what you need to do. You need to exploit that value because you get a bigger return. So it's about encouraging more girls to play, and it's about harnessing the benefits from that. So if you're going to spend limited resources, that's where you're going to get your return.
So should those investments be going into the grassroots rather than the elite game as a kind of like role modeling inspirational?
Well, anybody who's read the recent National Audit Office report would realize that the idea that major events demonstrate or produce participation is a bit of a triumph of hope over reality. And I have to be a bit careful here, bearing in mind where I am. But I always tell my students, if you think about it logically, in your lifetime as students, that sounds patronizing, but I remember a world when there wasn't sport live on the telly. So we didn't see a lot, but we participated more. Now there's more sport and people don't participate. So I don't think the demonstration effect is necessarily strong. However, that doesn't mean to say that if you take a sport that is potentially accessible, that wouldn't be strong. And I think one of the reasons why football is the most participating sport, it's more accessible. And if you think about the recreational level, it's the classic fast show sketch. All you need is a couple of jumpers down and a ball. And so this is something that is accessible. So I think that, there's a potential role model, but the most important thing is direct encouragement at the grassroots level, because that's how you build your base. And certainly that's the case in the United States, and certainly it's growing now phenomenally. So, so this is where you're going to get your biggest return, where you want to prioritize your investment. It's not necessarily at the major events, but I think when a sport is emerging, and it helps to sort of create the wind that other people can then sail along behind, which is different from something like the Olympics. I mean, at the end of the day, we all marvel at people like Chris Hoy and so on, but very few of us would have the inclination to ride a bike around a track. And that's not to disparage people who do, it's just the way it is. We know that's the case.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. We are not getting huge numbers of questions through on, oh, hold on, just as I say that, we have a question through in the chat from Martin. Have the wellbeing effects of wellbeing benefits for males been already absorbed in some way, so the marginal gains are smaller than for females?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Martin. So it's almost like my old economics teacher, oh God, this is going back now, it's the late 1970s, used to give us this example of sitting in the bar and drinking a gallon of Guinness. And obviously when you have your first pint of Guinness, you get the marginal gain that's very high. By the time you're getting towards your gallon, the marginal value is starting to get a lot smaller. So I think you're right, because these are marginal values that we're talking about, so they may well have been exhausted. And so this is about where do you next invest? And it's about effectively exploiting that additional value. So yeah, I think that's a good point, Martin. I think probably some of those gains, you've already picked the low-hanging fruit, so pushing after that extra stuff is going to be less efficient than going where you've got it almost like an open door and you'll be attracting the people who really want to get engaged in something. It's kind of revealing what economists call latent demand. It's giving it an opportunity to express itself.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I suppose it's a good indicator of where the money should be spent.
Yeah, that's the key thing. Yeah, so if you're going to, if you spend your whatever budget it is, this is where you're going to get your return.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much, Martin. Right, have we got any other questions that anyone would like to put to Paul? If not, oh, hold on. Peter Dickinson, I think, did you want to ask a question?
Hi, Paul. You all right?
Yes, hi, Pete.
I thought I'd throw something there a little bit, I don't know, left field. You can tell me whether it's not relevant, and apologies, I was teaching until 5, so I already came in halfway through. From what I picked up, my gut's to say that this is a policy issue, but the FA, for example, care very little about the money they get from Sport England. And at the same time, if it's supposed to be pushed through from a private side, bang for buck, being able to fill the football pitches, courts or whatever, I'm just wondering here the implications of the implications, so to speak, because it seems like you can, bang for buck, improve, enhance female football and the outcomes that come from what they'll be good for them, etc. But then at the same time, I'm sort of wondering whether, from an actual how the business model works and how the funding comes and where the money is, whether actually there's a need for government intervention to ensure the likes of the FA would need to push this further than they actually. I'm not saying they don't do a great job as it is relative to other governing bodies, but bang for buck, is the commercial incentive there to do it, or does it need government intervention to actually ultimately push it so that there is an equivalent marginal effect in, let's say, 10 years' time?
Yeah, I mean, a good point, Pete, actually, because clearly UEFA is probably not that interested in Germany and the UK. And for those who know anything about Germany, I know that football is probably the biggest sport and actually it actively works to kind of suppress other sports. But if you're looking at, say, some of the other countries, then where there's much more government intervention in terms of facility provision and engagement, this starts to have much more resonance, because you're right, things like the RFU in rugby, the Football Association here, and Deutsche Football and so on, they kind of operate almost in isolation, but there's still that bigger picture that at the end of the day, the FA does draw down at grassroots level funds, because it isn't just the FA that funds grassroots football, because you can apply for Sport England grants and so on and so forth. So it's about then, if you were pitching for one of those grants, what kind of provision are you going to make? Do you have a female team? Do you actively promote female coaches? And that's an interesting thing too, coming back to role models that Esther mentioned earlier. You know, what's really nice now is that you actually see it's female coaches running female national teams. It's not some has-been ex-footballer who's been thrown in to sort of manage those teams. And so I think you're right. It's a matter of degree. In the more developed football economies that say probably government intervention is probably less, but it's certainly not the case across Europe, where there's much more state intervention and there's a desire, you know, like everywhere, to spend money more wisely. A lot of facilities are public sector facilities and so on and so forth. So I think, and this is where UEFA's agenda is, and unfortunately now possibly with Brexit, we're sort of outside of that anyway, because it's really about speaking to the European Parliament and saying, you know, if you're, and they've just commissioned or just developed some further work trying to measure participation across Europe. They're looking to extend this. UEFA is saying, here's a model to think about how you can rationally allocate funds across, and it works in football. So the kind of wider implications of this to sport generally. And so, yeah, we probably, as the UK, typically, we're in Europe, but not necessarily of it. And I think we're a little bit outside of that. But yeah, I think it's a reasonable point, Pete. Very well made.
Cheers.
Right, thank you very much, Peter. Right, we have sort of come to 6:30 now, so it is about time to wrap up, unless there are any last questions, which I don't think there are. So I think it just remains for me to say thank you very much to Paul for this evening's talk. That's been really, really interesting. Thank you to everyone who's come along. We know it is a very hot evening, so thank you very much for giving up your time in the sunshine to come and spend the evening with us. We have recorded tonight's talk, so you will receive an email letting you know when the recording is available, should you want to view it again or share it with any friends or colleagues. Hopefully that should be with you by the end of the week. We have another public lecture coming up at the beginning of August around the Commonwealth Games, looking at strength and conditioning for endurance athletes. So if anyone is interested in that, that will be our next talk. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and thank you to Paul. And yeah, I will now draw this to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening.